Hi everyone. I was looking through people's thesis statements and noticed that a fair amount of people were unsure about their thesis, or didn't feel strongly about it. I also saw some thesis statements that I was concerned about, so I figured I would make a video in which I uh, talk fairly extensively about thesis statements. So in this video, I'm going to kind of talk about what a thesis statement should do. I'm going to go over a couple of different methods for writing thesis statements, and I'm going to end with just some general tips for having a good thesis. I'm sure some of this information will be old news to some people, but there's enough in this video, along with some pretty solid examples, that I think it will be useful to you. So I want to first begin with what a thesis does, or what should it do. One of the main things is that your thesis should restate your topic. Um, in my opinion, I should be able to read a person's thesis statement and no other part of their paper and get a pretty good idea of what they're going to talk about in the paper just by reading the thesis statement. If I read your thesis statement and it's not really clear what you are going to be talking about, then that is a good indicator that your thesis needs to be revised. Now, this second part here, this is kind of just a recommendation. Your thesis usually should identify a claim that you are making about your topic. Now, if you are in my Comp 1 class, some of you may be writing a more like exploratory paper where you're not really going to argue anything necessarily, or you're not going to take a firm stance. Also, if you're writing a more expository paper, or in other words, if your paper is more designed to inform, then your thesis may not be very debatable or arguable. But in general, I find it helps, regardless the type of paper that you're writing, for your thesis to be some sort of claim. Even if that isn't a hard and fast claim, even if it is still kind of exploratory, even if you're not taking a firm stance, I think it's still helpful to claim something about your paper. And now I don't have this written down here on this slide, but your thesis should also be your main idea. Excuse me. So if you have a thesis statement and that thesis statement doesn't capture the heart of your paper, if it doesn't capture like the spirit of of what you're going to be addressing, then it's probably not a super good thesis. So I think a helpful thing to do is, maybe once you have written your paper, to go back, read it through, and then take a look at your thesis statement and ask yourself, does this thesis do a good job of summing up everything that I address in this paper? And if not, that's a good indicator that your thesis is not going to be effective. And then my next piece of advice here, a thesis you should strive to not be obvious. If you are saying something that everyone would agree with, then there's maybe not a reason for you to be saying it. Now, again, this does kind of depend on the assignment, depends on the type of writing that you're doing. But in my experience of reading lots of papers, reading lots of thesis statements, the thesis statements that are obvious tend not to be very interesting, and the papers themselves tend not to be that great. So in your thesis, I would try to find something interesting to focus on, or try to say something that is unique, that's somehow your own perspective. You're adding something new to the conversation. Maybe you're putting a spin on something that someone else has already said. But if you're more or less saying something that everyone agrees with, or if you're saying something that's cliche, that's often not going to be a very good thesis. Down at the bottom of this screen here, I have, and hopefully this this thing here at the bottom will go away. There we go. So I have an example down at the bottom here. Now this is not a great thesis, but I'm going to walk you through what this thesis is doing well. And as a quick side note, a lot of my examples here are from kind of a history-based class that I used to teach. Most of my own thesis statements are about literature, which do not really apply to the type of writing that you all are doing. So I came up with some examples that might feel a little bit more relevant, but at the same time, these thesis statements tend to reflect a specific like time period. A lot of them look at the 1920s and Prohibition, and so don't be thrown off by that. I think a lot of what I have to say here will still be relevant and applicable to the thesis statements that you are creating. But anyways, so we have here, Prohibition was good for the economy. So this is restating our topic. It lets my reader know what the paper is going to be about. It's going to be about Prohibition, and it's going to be about Prohibition's effect on the economy. It is making a claim. This is something that I could argue. This is something that people could debate. And depending on how much you know about Prohibition and the economy, this is not a super obvious statement. It's not cliche. It's something that we could view from a variety of different perspectives. There's kind of an inherent complexity to it. So even though this is a pretty short thesis and it's not a very specific thesis, it's still doing some of the key things that a thesis statement should do. In the next slide here, though, we're going to focus on how to refine a thesis. So we started off with, kind of just the very basic elements of a thesis, and now we're going to work on refining your thesis, making it better. So a good first question to ask yourself is your thesis potentially interesting to your intended audience? And this kind of goes back to some of the things I talked about in the previous slide where, if you're saying something that's, super obvious, that's probably not going to be very engaging. So I would think about, what are you trying to accomplish in your writing? Who do you expect to be reading your writing? And then ask yourself, is my thesis going to be interesting to them? Is it going to make them care about what I have to say? Next, and this is honestly maybe the most important question you can ask yourself about a thesis, in my opinion, but is your thesis as specific as possible? Thesis statements that are too vague, I think that often leads the writer to getting off track or to not really having a clear focus. And it also makes it harder for your reader to follow along with what you're saying. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through this presentation. But making sure you have a specific thesis is really, really important. And then finally, when you're refining your thesis, you want to make sure that your thesis is manageable. And what I mean by that is, think about how long the paper needs to be. A 5-page paper is going to feel very different from a 10-page paper, which is going to feel very different from a 50-page paper. So, you want to make sure that you have enough to say based on whatever the required page length or word count is. And let me kind of talk you through what I mean by that by giving an example. So I have this same thesis here, Prohibition was good for the economy. I would say that this is not a very manageable thesis, regardless of how long my paper is. Because first of all, it's not specifying like what type of prohibition we're talking about. Is this the prohibition of alcohol from the 1920s and early 1930s in America? Is it the current prohibition of marijuana and other drugs? What kind of prohibition are we talking about? And it really doesn't even specify America. So what country are we talking about? What time period are we talking about? And then economy, that's also pretty broad. What aspect of the economy? The global economy, the national economy, the state economy, local economy. So there's a lot of things about this thesis, because it's not very specific, that make it not super manageable. If I were to write a paper based just on this thesis, there are a lot of things that I would need to talk about because I haven't sufficiently limited myself. So that's kind of why you want your thesis to be specific, because it will make your thesis and your paper more manageable. Next, I'm going to talk about how a thesis can create a roadmap for both you and for your reader. In my experience, a good thesis will help the writer organize the paper and will also help the reader follow along with what is being said. It can kind of forecast the main points. So let me walk you through an example here. I have improved the thesis that I had earlier. Prohibition was good for the U.S. economy because it gave many poor families new sources of income. With their improved financial situations, lower-class families stimulated the growth of small businesses, leading to a broader distribution of wealth. Now, there are still some things here about this thesis that we could probably hammer out, but this is a lot more specific and, in my opinion, a lot more interesting than that previous thesis. So let's walk through how this is kind of forecasting the main points. If I were to sit down and read this thesis, I would have a certain expectation for how the writer was going to organize their thoughts. First of all, in their intro, they'd probably talk about, prohibition. What kind of prohibition are they talking about? And they might say a little bit about the U.S. economy at the time. Then they're going to move on to talking about poor families getting new sources of income. It's probably going to be the first section of their body, the body of their paper. And then from there, they're probably going to move on to talk about how the improved financial situations of poor families help them stimulate the growth of small businesses. Let me see if I can move this. This is getting a little bit annoying for me. I might not be able to. Oh well. So I would expect them to talk about the improved financial situations being able to stimulate small businesses, and then I would expect them to end their paper by talking about how this led to a broader distribution of wealth. So you'll notice that I was following the layout of this thesis. The thesis is kind of written in order, and this should reflect the organization of your paper. The order of your ideas in your thesis and in your paper shouldn't just be random. And this is kind of what a lot of people are taught in high school. You would make a claim, so prohibition was good for the economy, and then you would just list 3 points. It was good for the economy because of X, because of Y, because of Z. And then, it didn't really matter what order you put those points in. As long as you talked about 3 points, you were good. But that doesn't usually lead to very good writing. So you want the order of your ideas to matter, and you want the order of your ideas in your thesis to reflect how they're going to be organized within your paper. And in my experience, that helps me stay on track. I've already laid out a plan for myself. I know the order of ideas that I need to go in, and I'm letting my reader know how my paper is going to be organized. Before they even really start to get into the paper, they already have an idea of what order the ideas are going to be in. Now I want to talk about one method for writing a thesis statement. This method is based on having a research question, which for many of you is applicable. This is something that I've asked you to do. You have a question that you're trying to answer. So the first step here is to state your topic as a question. And I have a couple of examples here for you. So let's say my topic is women's workplace clothing. So I could ask myself a question about that topic. Now, this is a question that I'm interested in exploring. This is something I want to learn more about. This is something I want to research. So I came up with, how did women's workplace clothing change in the 20s? And as another example, if my topic is divorce, a question that I want to learn more about is, why did divorce increase in the 20s? And you'll notice that these are Fairly open-ended questions. You know, they're asking how, they're asking why. So when you come up with a good research question, you usually want it to be a question that has a variety of answers, something that you could look at from different perspectives. I've noticed that some of you have come up with research questions that already have kind of obvious answers, or I can tell that based on your question that you already have an answer. You know, you're not interested in really finding out what sources have to say. You kind of just want to argue your point, which, you know, there's a time and place for that. But really, the idea behind research is to, find out other perspectives, figure out what other people are saying about your topic, and to come to new conclusions based on what other people have to say. But anyways, I'm going on a little bit of a tangent there. So first step, state your topic as a question. Next, turn that question into a position or into a stance. So I have a couple of examples here for you. One of my questions was, how did women's workplace clothing change in the 20s? And now I'm taking a stance here. I've turned this into a claim. Women's workplace clothing became shorter and looser to accommodate public transportation. Now I'll give you another example. If my question was, why did divorce increase in the 20s? Based on my research, I read some sources, I, watched a documentary or two, and then I developed my own conclusion. I realized that divorce increased in the 20s because women had increased financial independence. So that's step 2. Take your question, and after you've done some research, after you've figured out what other people have to say about your topic, then you come up with your position, what you are going to be demonstrating in your paper. And then step 3, and this is the final step, you want to narrow your thesis down. It's okay to start with a broad thesis, but your final thesis should be pretty specific. It should be pretty narrow. In my experience, the broader your thesis is, the harder it is to really develop that idea in depth. The more specific your thesis is, the easier it will be for you to think critically about the topic and to go into a good amount of detail, which is usually what your professors are going to be looking for. Usually I prefer to see someone going into a lot of depth about something specific rather than addressing something shallowly, or talking about a topic that's much too broad. So let me give you some examples of how I could narrow down my position here. So first, we have women's workplace clothing became shorter and looser to accommodate public transportation. And then in my narrower version, I've done a couple of things here to make my thesis more specific. I've said the dresses women wore to work in cities became shorter and looser to accommodate public transportation. Now, this is still a little bit broad. There's still other things I could do to make this thesis more specific, but I've made a good first step. So I'm not talking about all clothing. Instead, I'm specifically talking about dresses. And I'm not talking about all regions of the country, small towns, rural areas. I'm specifically going to be looking at cities. So just by adding like 2 words to my thesis, I have made it a lot more narrow. Let me give you another example. If my position is divorce increased in the 20s because women had increased financial independence, I could narrow it down by saying divorce increased amongst middle-class citizens because women had increased financial independence resulting from the availability of women's jobs. So here I've specified I'm not talking about everyone. I'm not talking about rich people. I'm not talking about poor people. I'm talking about middle-class citizens. And I'm going a little bit further to specify that the financial independence was a result of increased availability of work for women. There were more quote-unquote women's jobs in the 20s. So I've taken a pretty broad thesis and I've made it a little bit more specific and a little bit more narrow. So that's one method. You take your topic, you state it as a question, you do some research to find out what your stance is going to be. So you turn your question into a position or into a stance, and then you narrow it down. You try to make it as specific as you can. Now I'm going to go on to a different method. This is a method that I use when I write thesis statements for myself. You are not required to use this method, but it's one that I like. It's one that I think works pretty well. My method is a 4-step method. In a thesis statement, I make sure to state my topic, and then I make sure to say something that happens with the topic, something happens to the topic, something happens because of the topic. So a thesis needs to have an action. It needs to be focusing on something that has happened or is happening. And then from there, I try to add in something about how or why that thing happened, or what are the consequences of that. So we have a topic, something's going on with that topic, and then what's the result of that? And then the final step is to state the significance. Now, these first 3 steps are plenty. This can lead to a solid thesis, but I like to go the extra mile and I add in a statement of why my reader should care. I find this really important. I want to engage my readers. I want them to care about what I have to say, so I include that in my thesis. So let me give you an example here. We have women's clothing became shorter and looser in the 1920s as a means of accentuating women's femininity despite a decrease in public feminist sentiment. Let's break this down. So my topic is women's clothing in the 1920s. And then, something is happening. We need to have an action here. So women's clothing became shorter and looser. And then what are the consequences of that? What's the result? So women's clothing became shorter and looser as a means of accentuating women's femininity. So the way that women were dressing in the 1920s was more like flattering to their figures. It accentuated their womanhood. And then we end with a statement of why that matters. So women's clothing became shorter and looser as a means of accentuating their femininity despite a decrease in public feminist sentiment. So women's clothing was becoming more feminine even though at the time the public didn't care quite as much about feminism. And so I've told my reader I'm making a claim here. It's pretty specific. It's decently interesting. It's fairly manageable, and I've also included a statement of why my reader should care. Now let me give you, I'm going to skip this example, I might come back to it. Let me give you another example here. So, in A Jury of Her Peers, which is a short story, Susan Glaspell, the author, uses neglected fabric items, specifically a dirty towel, Minnie's clothes, and an unfinished quilt, to elicit empathy and insight from Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, not only to help the women uncover Minnie's motive, but to emphasize the importance of emotional intelligence. So let's break that down. First, we have our topic, which is the story, A Jury of Her Peers, and specifically, it is these fabric items, a towel, some clothes, and an unfinished quilt. Next, we need to say something about that topic. Something needs to be happening to, with, because of the topic. So we have these fabric items, and what are they doing? They're eliciting empathy and insight from Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters. Our next step, how or why did that happen? Or, what are the consequences of that? What are the results of that action? So, these fabric items are eliciting empathy and insight to not only help the women uncover Minnie's motive, so that's a result, that's a consequence. They're uncovering the secret. And then our last step is a statement of significance. So not only to help the women uncover Minnie's motive, but to emphasize the importance of emotional intelligence. So I'm letting my reader know, my topic, what's going on with the topic, what are the results of that, and then why should it matter? Now, I like this approach because it tends to lead to thesis statements that are pretty detailed, pretty specific, and they also are laying out, an organization. I like to have thesis statements that are very cause and effect oriented. This happened, which caused this, which leads to this. Or this happened, which resulted in this, and then this is why that matters. So I think that helps give my papers a sense of logic, and it gives them a structure that seems intentional. I'm not just listing random points, I'm focusing on causation. Now, I want to wrap up with just some final general tips about thesis statements. First of all, and this is huge, and I've seen some issues with this, a thesis cannot be stated as a question. It just can't, because statements and questions are inherently two different things. And it's right there in the name, a thesis statement. Now, as we talked about earlier in this presentation, you can create a thesis based on a question, but a thesis can never be a question itself. So if you posted your thesis in the discussion board and it was a question, that is not a thesis statement. You have to make sure that it is a statement and not a question. Next, your thesis should be concise. And this is a hard line to find, because you want your thesis to be specific, you want it to be very detailed, but you don't want it to be too long. A thesis that is super long will oftentimes be hard to read, will be hard to follow. And in my experience, the more that you cram into a thesis, the harder it is for you to prove all of those things. So if you list like 10 different things in your thesis, then you are obligated to talk about those 10 things in your paper, which is often hard to do and can result in your writing being pretty shallow. So you want to make sure that your thesis is specific, but that you're not saying too much. I recommend that you aim for one sentence. When writing a thesis, try to say everything you need to say in one sentence, and then if that sounds too wordy, it sounds too clunky, turn it into 2 sentences. But your thesis should really never be more than 2 sentences, and I think it's best if you try to aim for 1. As I've been harping on a lot, it needs to be specific. The more specific your thesis is, the easier it will be for your readers to understand what you are claiming. And I also recommend qualifying your thesis. Basically, no argument is going to be true 100% of the time. Everything is contextual. We are accurate in some cases. Whatever you're arguing in your paper, whatever you're claiming, whatever you're trying to show in your paper is not going to be true in every situation 100% of the time. So you usually need to qualify your thesis. So instead of saying like, all Democrats, you could say there is a trend among Democrats, or instead of saying, all small business owners, you could say many small business owners. So using words like some, many, oftentimes, frequently, that's a way of, still claiming something, but not being too forceful. By saying oftentimes or frequently, you're acknowledging that your claim is not going to be true all the time. And also, you can qualify or limit your thesis by being very specific. In my earlier examples, I wasn't talking about all women, I was talking about women in cities. And when the thesis about divorce, I wasn't talking about divorce across America, I was talking about divorce specifically for middle class people. So by adding in those kinds of qualifying statements, I'm helping give my reader a better idea of what exactly I'm going to be saying. And then finally, I've noticed this a little bit as well. Be sure to be open to other ideas and perspectives. The point of research writing is to learn something. And now it is okay to have biases. Everyone does. Anyone who says that they are unbiased is lying to you, or they are ignorant. Everyone has biases. And it's also okay to express opinions. But if you are not meaningfully engaging with other people's ideas, if you're not respecting other perspectives, other worldviews, other viewpoints, if you are not even giving the time of day to, the other side of the argument, that is going to really hurt your credibility. And now this isn't a widespread issue. I've only noticed some issues with a couple of people, but you want to make sure that as you're doing your research, as you're doing your writing, that you are meaningfully engaging with other ideas and that you aren't letting your own biases overwhelm the credibility and the logic of your own perspective. So, I know there's a lot in this video, but hopefully some of those examples or some of those methods will be useful to you. If you have any like follow-up questions, feel free to email me. But I wanted to make sure that I gave you another resource to help you develop a really good thesis statement.